urbanismo, ¿cierto? En este día tan especial empezamos en el Instituto también una semana enfocada en la ciudad y los territorios, donde se van a estar desarrollando esta serie de jornadas de investigación entre un montón de otras actividades. El jueves tenemos un conversatorio súper interesante también que aborda el tema post-pandemia en torno a la vivienda y la marginalidad en Latinoamérica, y la próxima semana tenemos un seminario de regeneración urbana. Así que tenemos un mes bastante movido e intenso en esta conmemoración sobre la importancia de planificar y pensar las ciudades donde vivimos. Y abrimos este mes, en este día, con Brenda Parker. En esta ocasión nos va a acompañar Javier, apoyándonos también en la traducción de quienes quieran preguntar, a veces si hay alguna palabra que no se entienda, nos va a estar apoyando. Y le doy la palabra a Javier para que presente hoy día a Brenda y a Pía Montealegre, que nos vino a comentar. Estamos muy agradecidos, Pía. Gracias a ustedes.
So I'll start in English. Good afternoon, everybody. As Valentina was saying, this is the World Day of Urbanism, of urban planning. It depends on which country are you spelling that. We're honored to have Brenda Parker here. Brenda was my professor in my doctoral program at the University of Chicago. And she was colleague of Janet Smith. Janet Smith was 5 years ago, 2017, as a professor, invited professor here too. And we brought her for teaching a course on gender and the city, which is an open course, and there are still some spots if you want to register for some open classes. But also for this talk. This is a special talk. It's not part of the course. It's a more open or how do you say, like a more wide talk in terms of topics. And we would like to start with a short presentation of each one here to know who is assisting this talk. You can either do that in English or in Spanish, whatever is comfortable for you, so we can know each other better, because it's just a small room and we can have a more comfortable situation. So before starting with Brenda, I'll have maybe from here.
Okay.
If you want to present your name and where you come from.
Okay, my name is Pía Montealegre. I did study here. I did study in the Institute. I made my master degrees in urban development, and also I do my doctorate here. I am an architect, but I work at the Universidad de Chile, at the Heritage and History Institute, and I am also kind of a director of how do you say, extension outreach
Yeah.
and that sort of things at faculty.
Thank you very much. Over here.
Hola, yo me llamo Rocío Arancibia, soy arquitecta y magíster de esta universidad y ahora trabajo en asesoría urbana en la Municipalidad de Las Condes.
Architect and master degree from this university, and works at the municipality of Las Condes, a higher income neighborhood over there. And we will talk about that, but thank you for coming.
Yo soy Ignacia, exalumna también de arquitectura acá de la Católica, y ahora trabajo como arquitecta independiente en un estudio en temas de vivienda privada y pública.
So she's an independent architect from this university, and doing independent work with topics of housing, private and public housing.
Hola, yo soy Ariel Aguilera, dirijo Fundación de Raíz, dedicada a mejorar la calidad de vida de los niños, y estoy haciendo mi tesis en la Universidad Diego Portales sobre escenarios para la planificación urbana de los cuidados.
So, okay, he runs a foundation who works with kids, and now his thesis, master thesis, I guess, is about care and children.
Hi, I'm Giovanni Vecchio. I'm not a planner, so I guess this is my day to celebrate. I'm a professor here. I mainly work with mobility, inequalities, and urban planning, but gender and care are some issues that are the more important, also in relation to mobility. So I look forward to listening to your work.
Hi, Brenda. Hi. I met you this morning. My name is Magdalena. I'm an urban historian and planning history. I'm focused on planning history. I'm very interested in this topic because, well, from many points of view, but mainly because we just finished. We concluded a research project which was called, well, with Javier and other colleagues, which was called Housing, Neighborhood and City during pandemics. And some of the outcomes that came out from that project was the importance of care and housing, that relationship. So I'm very interested in your talk. Well, these outcomes were recently published in a journal from this faculty, but I think it was really, really relevant, the way in which current housing from a gender perspective was critical for facing pandemic and especially social distancing and so on.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carolina Rojas. Also, I am a professor at the Institute. I am a geographer. Well, I am interested in your talk because I have a research with the University of Concepcion about mobility care and facility with a colleague from there. Also, I am a part of the unit of gender equity at the faculty. So we are interested to promote the best opportunity to women and the community.
Just one note, sometimes we say faculty when we meet school. This entire thing is the faculty or a school, right? But in the US, faculty is a professor.
People.
People, not the campus, right? Just okay.
Mi nombre es Jaime Vargas, yo vengo de Perú y bueno, soy estudiante del Magíster en Desarrollo Urbano. Y bueno, sí, eso, y actualmente me interesa mucho el tema por el tema de la marginalidad, ¿no? Y justamente la perspectiva crítica que tiene consigo, ¿no? Por así decirlo, ¿no? El urbanismo desde el género.
So he's Peruvian, he's studying a master here. He works with me actually in his thesis. And he's interested in terms of topics of marginality and stigmatization actually for his thesis, but also in critical perspectives on gender as well.
Good afternoon, my name is Ferdinand Bonnet. I am also a student of the master's degree here in urban development. I worked some years as a consultant for participatory processes in urban development. And actually the pandemic had one very nice thing for us. That's because of the digital processes. It was the first time that we could have people who are responsible for others, for children or elder people, be able to participate, because now it was digital. So we had a lot of babies on screen, and it was something we never managed with all the resources we could to get these people to participate. It was possible during the pandemic. So I'm very eager to listen to that.
Hi, I'm Valentina Rosas Krause. I'm Chilean, moved back to Chile a couple months ago. I was living in Michigan, working at the University of Michigan. Now I'm an assistant professor at Universidad de Chile, pretty far away from here, but I'm a graduate of this program and I did my PhD in architectural history at Berkeley.
Nice.
Thank you for coming. Well, that's with the round of presentations. So I will leave you now with Brenda. Thanks for this. It's gonna be like 40-minute presentation.
And just speed me up if I.
And you have the time. Yeah.
Okay.
I can.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'll try to talk slowly, but please let me know if I can be a little more clear, if that's helpful. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited for this talk and then for the talks that or classes that I'll be teaching. And I'm always happy to have one-on-one conversations with people about our shared interests, because I heard so many things among what you said that relate to what I do. So I'm always happy to have that conversation. And I thank you, Javier, for that introduction. And I just want to acknowledge that all research has co-producers, colleagues, and funders, and Catherine Leviton-Reed from University of Cape Breton in Canada, and I have collaborated a lot, and Janet Smith, who Javier mentioned, the late Janet Smith, and I did some work together on housing, and Janet was really an inspiration as a leader, as somebody who cared about care, about workers' rights, about cities. And we're going to be doing a special issue in the Journal of Urban Affairs that's focused on, how do we call it? Creating caring cities and institutions. And so there are going to be several different articles, and it's still in work, but I'll share with Javier that you might be interested, and it's in honor of Janet Smith as well. So be on the lookout for that. More broadly, this is just a little slide that says a bit about me. I'm a feminist urbanist. I'm a feminist urban geographer. And, you know, some of the theories that I draw upon are at the top there. Some of the methods and epistemologies that I focus on are on the right. I'm very interested in intersectional work, so that's going to show up in all that I do. I'm interested in kind of a feminist critical political economy, so that's going to pervade my work. Some of the things that I study are urban governance, urban politics. I do a lot of work with people who have been incarcerated, so carceral geographies, abolitionist geographies, and urbanism. And then obviously I'm interested in housing and commons. I do some work on disabilities and gender and race. Most of my work is in the North American context, but I do collaborate and engage with folks around the world. So often, like in this talk today, while some of it's centered on North America, there's resonances across the world. So you should be able to see that. And then, you know, just in terms of how I do my work, I know there's increasingly pressure on academics to be engaged, to do work with communities, but that is really essential and important to what I do, even as it's hard to figure out how to balance, right? Doing your academic writing, your teaching, and your community work. But much of what I do is driven by people I work with in communities. And more broadly, I'm interested in how do we think about feminist cities. So I've written a lot about feminist cities and can we build cities that are based on care and collectivity and commons instead of cities that are focused on competition and capitalism, and how do we go about doing that, and what do we highlight in that process? So my talk today is going to focus on housing, and there's a lot of conversation right now among academics and policymakers about this global housing crisis. A recent study showed that 90% of housing in a study of 200 cities was found unaffordable. And we know it's not just cities that are suffering from housing problems, but also rural places. And as we see the rise of gentrification, the expansion of global capitalism, Airbnb, right? All of these things, we see both small and large places are basically struggling with housing availability, housing affordability, and housing quality. And I agree with Desiree Fields. I really like her work on housing and capitalism, that we say that this is a crisis, but in fact, you know, the current international housing crisis is a feature, not a bug, less an emergency than a consistent aspect of a capitalist political economy predicated on private property, market exchange, and the capital accumulation imperative. But what I don't think Fields talks enough about, and what my work really tries to bring into, is that housing has also been shaped by colonialism and patriarchy and racism and other kinds of power relations, right? And both the way we do or do not provide housing, the way housing is designed, who is included and excluded. So I'm really interested in bringing to this conversation that critiques housing as a commodity. How do we think about the other version, which is housing as an infrastructure of care and broader infrastructures of care that enable more caring cities and better housing situations. So I also want to argue as part of that story that these burdens of housing precarity, which you all know, have not been evenly shared, right? So in particular, I want to talk about 5 gendered intersectional disparities and how they shape kind of vulnerability around shelter and survival for low-income women, diverse low-income women. And then again, we'll kind of go back to, can we think about housing and care and the kinds of infrastructures, pequeña y grande, right, that enable or support. Okay, so I think probably most people know here that the disparity, one of the primary disparities that has become very visible is around caring, right? So globally, women do the vast majority of caregiving. They're more likely to be lone parents, right? And even though things are changing in heterosexual relationships to some extent, depends on where you are and who's involved, and becoming more equal, we know that still the vast majority of caring is done by women, not just caring for children, but caring for extended family members, caring for elders, caring for communities. So we often find that on the front lines of caring jobs and nonprofit sectors and community organizing, we often see women doing this work, right? So it's the work. Sometimes we call this social reproductive labor, right? That holds up communities, but still remains vastly undervalued, okay? And in the communities that I work with, and I imagine you do in different ways from what I've heard, communities that have been destroyed by violence, or in my case, incarceration, women take on other children. They take on roles that need to happen because these communities have been so devastated. So overall, we see this, disparity in caring. And of course, the pandemic made this extra clear, right? That when workplaces were closed down, when schools were closed down, we could see that disproportionately, even as there are exceptions, women were burdened. And we saw the fallout from that. And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of leaving the labor force, in terms of mental health, all of these things that are related. So when I talk about these 5 disparities, caring overload being the first, they're all intertwined, right? And they all were sort of exacerbated by the pandemic. I'm going to stop. Am I talking at a speed that's accessible?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just trying to slow myself down. I know, because I try to learn a little Spanish, and when people talk fast, it's way harder. Okay, I also want to talk about intersectional and gender-based violence, which of course is also wrapped up in housing. So I'm going to say a few things. Women are more likely to face sexual, intimate, and structural violence from intimate partners, family members, employers, landlords, right? I mean, there are lots of examples in the work that I do where people have to trade sex for rent, right? Where landlords pressure women. And in workplaces, right, we see gendered and structural violences that affect women. And just as caring is deeply related to housing, gender-based violence is usually the primary reason that women in North America, combined with income, end up in precarious housing situations, right? Because they maybe stay in a situation because they can't, they need the housing, they stay in a violent situation, or they leave a violent situation to become homeless or unhoused, and it becomes a cycle. So this relationship between violence, multiple kinds of violence, really is an important one. So shelters, which we could argue aren't even the best strategy, right? Why does somebody who's a survivor have to leave their home in order to be safe, right? But they're often not culturally sensitive, depending on where you are in the world, might not be friendly to LGBTQ plus people, to trans folks, to migrants, whatever it may be. And we know that shelter space in many parts of the world has always been widely insufficient, and that during the pandemic, things got worse, right? People couldn't leave, etc. So again, all of these kinds of situations are intersectional. We know that trans women, women of color, Indigenous women suffer high levels of violence in both public and private places, in workplaces, etc. So this gender-based violence is intersectional. And the more marginalized you are, whether it's, you're migrants and you don't know the local services, whatever it may be, these can be even more desperate situations. And also during disasters, right? And climate change is exacerbating disasters. Gender-based violence wildly increases, in case people don't know, right? So, okay, income and wealth inequalities, that's the third disparity. And again, this is gendered, but it's raced, it can be about class. I mean, it obviously is about class, it can be about caste, it can be about ethnicity, depending on where you are. And of course, this is going to deeply shape your housing opportunities, right? If you have income fragility or income disparity, if you're a lone caregiver, all of these issues, which we know are gendered, raced, ableist, etc., affect your accessibility to housing. So, just a little bit of data points in the US, 30% of female-headed households are in extreme or deep poverty, close to half of the poverty line. Globally, you can just see that these are some of the female poverty rates. And again, it's very difficult to look at this data globally, but because, I want to give a bit of a global perspective, female poverty rates are always higher and they're always intersectional, right? And they're always also kind of undercalculated. This, again, is specific to the United States, but what this shows is the earnings of women, and in particular, women of color compared to white men. And so you can see that the disparities for Black and Hispanic women in the United States are quite profound. I also do work on disabilities, and depending on what kind of disability you have, the disparity can be like, 16 cents to $1 if you have a mental disability, right? So it's very profound. And one of the things we know about the pandemic is that it seemed in some ways like the gender gap was declining, but the pandemic has kind of set that clock back a little bit in terms of gender, wealth, and income disparities. Okay, and wealth is the other side of this. So this is just income disparities, right, that we're looking at. But I think we know that women, intersectional women in particular, who have multiple marginalizations, they work part-time. They don't work year-round. They're trying to balance care with earnings. So it's not really 60 cents to $1 because that's full-time working people, right? It means you're earning a lot less. And that means how can you pay for housing? Can you find housing that's big enough, etc. Okay, a fourth inequality I wanted to talk about has to do with health, well-being, and disability. So I want to be wary that disability and ability, that those can be kind of pejorative words, and there are sort of colonizing discourses about who's able and who's not. But at the same time, I want to understand health, well-being, and disability as important areas of inequality that persist in parts of an intersectional picture, okay, and that deeply relate to housing. So there's gendered and race disparities in terms of anxiety, depression, and mental disabilities, okay? So it means that we see higher rates of post-traumatic stress syndrome, of anxiety and depression among women, and even higher rates of severe mental disability. And in fact, it's also really about caregiving that often we see this disparity. So caregivers tend to report more stress, more trauma, more anxiety. And again, we saw this in the pandemic really amplify, even as people found kind of creative alternatives to support each other. Something I really like Ruby Mendenhall's work, often when we think about healing from mental or other kind of health challenges, we do this in a very medical way, at least in North America, right? It's siloed. It's not about does the whole community need support and healing, right? It's not about what are the root causes of suffering, et cetera. And so all of this, again, comes back to housing. So housing precarity and being unhoused or homeless are deeply intertwined with well-being and mental health. So you see that if you're unhoused or precariously housed, you're more likely to have mental health issues. If you have mental health issues, you're more likely to be precariously housed. And again, this is just a chart. And really, I think the important thing is looking at the severeness of mental disability, which is that yellow part, and how that tends to be gendered. So women are more likely to face severe disabilities. Okay, and as Javier and I were just talking about this, there's a lack of both female and diverse representation in governance and leadership. So women actually tend to need housing supports and services the most, but they often have the least to say about those allocations, about the design of housing services for architects and planners and policymakers. I think you know this, right? So what we need is a greater representation. It's not the only answer. And, you know, much of my work reminds people of this and other work, that it's not that if you're born in a female body or you present yourself as female that you're automatically going to make decisions that are progressive or that benefit, but your lived experience does matter, right? And so that relates to all these things that we're talking about. And again, just a little bit of data we're really looking at in terms of just some representation. You know, women are 26 to 36% of national and local governance officials, and few are in housing and urban affairs departments. When women are involved in housing work, it's often at like the nonprofit or the NGO stage and less at the kind of decision-making and design parts. And again, in many places, colonialism has uprooted traditional and women-centered decision-making and participation, some of the things that you mentioned in your work. And again, if you're talking about women with multiple marginalizations, whether it's caste or disability or ethnicity or migrant status, then these numbers are even lower. Even as some data suggests that there are some gender differences in governance, that women are more willing to allocate more towards housing and social services, that they are more likely, there's always going to be exceptions, to be participatory in their leadership, right? So there's some data that shows that there's actual different things. This is just a chart that basically, this is from the United States, but is showing that the vast majority of people, low-income renters in the United States, don't get assistance. And that's just kind of going back to my point that we have policymakers that may be indifferent, they're not represented, et cetera. So those are the 5 disparities. I've actually written an article about this. So if you want to read, what I said is not very clear, you want more data, feel free to go back to that. And then I'm going to talk about this other part of my paper in a minute. So what are the consequences of all of those disparities when we think about housing? These are just some of them, right? That we have higher rates of eviction in North America among women of color. Displacement affects women. It certainly affects, and it's not that all women have children or are caregivers, but they're certainly more likely to be. And so when a caregiver gets evicted or is unhoused, there's a multiplier effect there. We also see that being unhoused or being homeless is not always as visible if you're a woman, right? Because the way we think about homelessness doesn't always show that there are 3 or 4 women living in one apartment together and the stresses that happen, right? So I work with a lot of people who are like, yeah, you know, my sister invited me to live with her, but then she kicked me out 2 months later because the kids couldn't get along. It was too much. So in these precarious arrangements, there's a lot of instability that also flows back to issues of income disparity or violence or caring challenges. Okay, so these are the results of these kind of everyday disparities. And then when you added pandemic precarity to that, right? But I also want to keep reminding us that we had housing precarity before this, right? We need root solutions, not just like, oh, the pandemic.
I'm gonna put a bridge on Chile. Double up is not very known as a concept in many countries, but in this country it's called allegados. And it's a very Chilean problem, actually. If you ask for the same problem in Latin America, they won't know.
Okay.
But here is a well-known problem.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. That gives a lot of context. And again, I'll just say that there are always particular populations, you know, in the places that you work where these marginalizations happen. I work with women who have been in prison or been incarcerated, and the numbers are very high in terms of being unhoused, being homeless, et cetera. And the part of that has to do with the fact that many women in the United States go to prison because they have histories of abuse and trauma, and that might fuel into addiction, and because we have a country that incarcerates a lot of people in general, but those same problems then follow them and shape their futures, as well as a lack of overall housing affordability. Okay, so those are the kind of disparities that I am interested in kind of highlighting and then thinking about how do we work against. So the way I think about crises is that in terms of housing, it's not a new crisis, but visibility of a kind of crisis like the pandemic does allow for new opportunities and political options to bubble up. So I am writing another paper that's looking at how are, Canada and the United States and Australia, that just happens to be the collaborators on this project, how are they responding to the visibility of housing crisis? Are they becoming more progressive or not? So I'm very interested in, is this a moment to highlight kind of old and new solutions that think about infrastructures of care and housing and stop kind of attending to only one of them, okay? And I'm very interested in strategies that are rooted in feminist ethics of care, in commoning and collectivity. And whether these are kind of, options for some of these disparities. So I am going to give some examples from some collectives and commoning efforts that are emerging or have kind of persisted. And then I want to talk back a little bit about policy and government solutions. So there's a pretty interesting endeavor that really for people in the United States is maybe more novel than it is for other parts of the world. But in Oakland, California, there is an example where several women, a kind of coalition of women with children who were unhoused or homeless, and yet we're looking around the city of Oakland where there were all these empty houses that were owned by investors or landlords who just were leaving them open and waiting for property value to increase or waiting to sell them. And so they began just squatting, again, which is not a new phenomenon in many parts of the world, but in fact, we're able to sort of call attention to this effort, and ultimately we're able to secure the house, and we're able to arrange financing for several women to live in this house together, again, by agreement, not necessarily because your sister let you move in, but as a sort of commons to think about this and to raise attention to the fact that the city ought to be able to reclaim housing that is purely speculative when there's not enough housing for people that live there. So there's actually a short little documentary about this that you might be interested in. There's also a cooperative collective in North London called New Ground Co-Housing. So again, as I talk about each of these, I'm thinking of these disparities and how they address them. So this is actually for elderly women or senior women who, I don't know exactly how this translates in Chile, but tend to be extra poor because of that income wealth gap that I described, right? So it's like by the time they're a senior, they've lost all these opportunities for wealth. Perhaps somebody left them. There are a number of different things. And women, in some cases, outlive men if they were in a heterosexual partnership. So these women have formed a cooperative for senior women. And one of the things that comes out in this cooperative is how much caring happens in this space and how much caring people offer to each other. So a feminist ethics of care is about caring for self and caring for others, right? We often talk about children because that is very important, but you see it can manifest in these different ways. Here we have moms talking about an ethic of care and how it's violent to not have housing and caring for their children together. And here we have elderly women caring for each other.
Just for context, we have a big issue about pensions in Chile.
Yes.
And of
yes.
course, the most problematized with that are elder women.
Yes, yes.
And
yes.
they have the big wealth gap
Yes.
in terms of men.
Yes, exactly. So again, this addresses caring, which is a need. It also addresses income and other kinds of disparities, right? Again, this is just another example of a cooperative. And again, what the women here talk about is, and I'm kind of focusing on feminist commoning, but there are other kinds of commons as well. And talking about how sharing resources is a wonderful economic way of living. Many women who have been in violent situations find that a cooperative living arrangement that's secure and where there's support for caregiving. Many lone parents or single moms find this available. And then also many cooperatives that I've looked at around the world, they tend to create either informally or formally these emergency funds. So they're also noting that someone may have a crisis, and if that person needs to borrow money or use money and then maybe put it back, then that's an available thing. So often when you have these kind of commons and collectives, they can be about a number of things. They can be about sharing caring duties. They can be about sharing economic resources, about living more frugally in general, but then also these extra kinds of supports. So I'm also interested in feminist commons where women are taking more leadership roles because again, it's tricky, right? Because sometimes women just get extra work. Like, hey, you coordinate the cooperative, right? And I think there's a fine line between having leadership and power and just doing the grunt work. So we want to be thinking that through, right? As anybody knows, right, who all of a sudden is bringing the food to the meetings and all that, like, how do we think about meaningful leadership and design opportunities for women? And then in some cooperatives around the world, they're also looking at things like ownership, and there are different models of ownership and collectives. So, you can look at different models, but just making sure that gender disparities around land ownership, around wages, et cetera, are important. Because, something that Silvia Federici has written a lot about too is like, you can have these leftist cooperatives, et cetera, but that whole thing about caring and social reproduction sometimes just isn't really dealt with in an equitable way. And then, there are, I think, increasingly feminist architects and feminist design interventions that are really thinking about, and if you're not familiar with like Dolores Hayden and some of these kind of historical ideas about how we can design the city differently, then I think that's, again, another way. So it's about having leadership and power, but also thinking differently about how we design housing and how we design cities in ways that enable care. There's a pretty interesting example from Vienna where it's really intergenerational household, and it's also thinking about how seniors can take part, elderly people, in caregiving, and how that's also about relationship building too. So sometimes these models think not just narrowly about maybe who needs care right now, but also a bigger picture of what caring means, right? And what it means to be a carer often means that, assuming you're not just simply overburdened with labor, that some of that caring comes back to you. Okay, I'm just gonna say maybe one other thing, and then I think I've stuck with my time pretty good. Oh, wow, I'm actually kind of under. So, well, that's okay, because that will give more time for conversation if you're interested. So there, in the literature, the academic literature, and among policymakers, there is a call for infrastructures, for urban infrastructures, for housing as infrastructure. We have some examples of policymakers who, this is Cori Bush, she slept outside at the US Capitol to kind of protest the end of the eviction moratorium. There are several progressive Black women in California, the West Coast of the United States, who have lobbied for pretty progressive housing bills that begin to acknowledge that housing as an infrastructure is needed, right? To some extent, there's been a little bit of that coming out of United States policymakers to think about caregiving, right? Because caregiving in the United States and much of North America, I think there's a lot of similarities in Chile, but I will let you all be the experts. We don't get a lot of support from governments, from, you know, the whole idea of caring as a labor of love, of not having the support from vouchers or for child cares, et cetera. That's how it operates primarily in the US. And there's a lot of resistance from non-feminists of like caring as an infrastructure. What do we need? You know, we need bridges, we need, so there are a lot of masculine ideas about infrastructure that refuse to acknowledge that care and caregiving is an important infrastructure, and that frankly, if you don't have those, then the loss of bridges, et cetera, may not be as important, or we could at least say that they're equally as important. Yet so much of the conversation right now in urban infrastructure and other kind of infrastructure conversations isn't really acknowledging how caring and housing and the joining of those two as infrastructures is really essential right now. So I think I'll stop, and then I can say more about anything that might be of interest instead of just talking and not knowing what you're interested in. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda.
Ahora damos la palabra a Pía para los comentarios y después abrimos la mesa y recogemos comentarios en el público.
I'll talk from a comment from Pia, but wait a second. I'm going to be translating for her. You have much better English than me.
Do you want help? Okay.
Do you want to do that?
I mean,
It's exhausting.
I know. We can, I can, let's do it together.
Okay.
So you can rest and I can, you know.
And I can
do a
understand a little bit
turn.
of Spanish, but the nuances I certainly won't get.
Try to go slow and we will translate.
Okay.
No, pero puedo partir yo.
Sí.
La conozco bien.
Ponte,
Que puedo leer su mente.
ponte cerca.
No, a lo
Sí,
mismo.
sabe lo que
No digo que es para Brenda.
Pero ya.
Sí, comentaré en castellano para poder ordenar mis ideas mejor. Los 5 puntos que levanta Brenda me parece que sin duda son los 5 puntos que deben ser priorizados y deben ser levantados para poder hacer un enfoque desde un organismo feminista, y no puedo estar más de acuerdo.
Sí, como en cortos y de ahí
Sí, perfecto, ya sé yo voy
I know it's hard.
So she says the
Yeah.
5 main points that you raise are, she agrees, are the 5 main points to start to think about reforming, reforming urban and planning. It's a very short version of what she said, but she said it more beautifully.
Quisiera referirme al concepto de interseccionalidad como un concepto proveniente de la filosofía feminista y que tan bien se aplica a los problemas territoriales. Y en el caso nuestro de Chile, especialmente, porque somos un país muy desigual y Santiago es una ciudad profundamente desigual. Por lo que, sí.
I actually think I understand what she said.
Yeah.
The intersectionality is especially important
and
to apply in the situation of Santiago, which is very unequal.
yeah, and maybe she also means how the term coming from feminist philosophy is
Translated.
you know,
Okay.
translated, packed into the
Okay.
planning and.
Gotcha.
so, yeah.
Okay.
Podríamos decir que un urbanismo feminista, especialmente en Latinoamérica, es por definición interseccional porque se intersecta con el espacio.
Right, saying by definition, feminist urbanism in Latin America has to be intersectional because it intersects with space. It's also testing.
Y me ha llamado la atención que los puntos que levantan son los mismos puntos que hemos observado en las ciudades latinoamericanas y especialmente en las ciudades en Chile.
So you got it right, that it's surprising how similar the situation in Latin American cities compared to US cities.
Sí, quizás decir que el efecto de la pandemia, Zoom effect, fue una especie de dilución de las fronteras entre lo doméstico y lo laboral. En el momento en que caímos en momentos de reclusión doméstica, pudimos ver una esfera que estaba puertas adentro y cómo se contaminaban esas dos esferas. Lo que yo llamaba, perdón, una vida en planta libre.
Yeah, she talks about how the pandemic sort of blended domestic private space with public space, and she called this the open plan living of you know, modern life, and how sort of the pandemic brought that forward.
Sí, pero al mismo tiempo la crisis desarrolló algo que es la necesidad de actuar en comunidad, de formar comunidades para resolver la crisis, que permitió que las comunidades pudieran poner en evidencia las problemáticas que estaban puertas adentro y que tenían que ver con el cuidado.
So that in response to the crisis and the pandemic, it also allowed new communities to be formed and new commoning. And those in turn were able to make these problems that had been in the private sphere visible.
Sí. Por ejemplo, quisiera mencionar las ollas comunes.
Yeah, she wants to talk about ollas comunes was
Community kitchens.
Yes, community kitchens, exactly. But that have a long history here. Before, in the Unidad Popular and during the dictatorship.
Que fueron una estrategia de subsistencia. Y la no participación de ciertos integrantes de la comunidad a las mujeres que organizaban estas ollas, que es una medida del cuidado, les llamaba la atención porque encendía la voz de alarma de que algo pasaba en ese mundo interior.
I don't know if I interpreted this right, but so not only the actual caring through food of these community kitchens, but actually the organization of these women, they were alerted when one of their women wasn't present in, you know, making the food and, or could, you know, see signs of trouble in a household that they couldn't see through that organizing and sort of coming together.
Y para muchas mujeres, esa labor de cuidado colectivo se transformó en una válvula de escape para sus propias violencias domésticas o situaciones complejas domésticas. Y coincidía en que eran o personas de edad o migrantes que no tenían redes de amigas o de familia que las apoyara.
So it's about, again, intersectionality. A lot of these women in the community kitchens were intersectionally, you know, were both migrants or didn't have strong communities. So they built these sort of communities through that caring of others, but that also cared of themselves in many multiple ways.
Y de cierta manera esas acciones comunitarias nos hicieron quizás mirar muy positivamente el tema de la organización y el rol de las mujeres en esa organización comunitaria.
Yeah, and all that sort of the success of these sort of community endeavors, and I don't know, it's so much easier to speak in passive in Spanish, so I don't know the who is here. ¿Te refieres quién cuando dice nos hace ver como
a la sociedad?
Oh yeah, okay. So society in general, it made it much more again visible that these sort of not minority, but that these women were playing the role that before was hidden.
Yep.
Pero algo se me fue.
No, creo que está bien.
Ya.
Y bueno, y quizás también levantar como el tema a propósito de la cita que estaba al principio sobre la crisis de vivienda como una característica más que una anomalía en el capitalismo, que estaba al comienzo. Justamente en estos momentos la organización para las tomas de terreno están empezando a ser vistas más como una solución, justamente a una crisis que será constante, más que una acción que debe contenerse porque puede venir, digamos, una solución.
Right. So she wants to go also back to the opening quote about the global housing crisis and sort of reflecting on the point that it's not a crisis, but it's actually endemic to how capitalism works. And that more and more sort of emergency solutions like the ones created in Chile where a community would take over land.
Yes.
And that was later
Yep.
given, legalized in little lots, that was, you could no longer think of that as emergency, but it's ongoing
Yes.
and needs to be seen as a response to an ongoing problem and not just a
Yes.
punctual crisis, a crisis of the now.
Y ahí, para no prolongar esta doble conversación, quizás apelar a una crisis, o sea, no una crisis, a una crítica a la idealización del comunitarismo cuando llegamos a las soluciones. Un poco por la escala, primero, de las soluciones. Y por otro, porque siento de que no es un enfoque de justicia. O sea, cuando no existe realmente la dotación de autonomía económica, de una institucionalidad del cuidado, de una ciudad que estructuralmente se configure como una ciudad que cuida, sigue cayendo en la voluntad de ser parte de una comunidad, el deseo de ser parte de una comunidad. Y creo que lo que debemos tratar desde el urbanismo feminista es lograr la autonomía.
So this is very beautifully said, and I think very important. So I'm gonna do my best to. So part of it is and I think she shares this with you. Also a critique of this praising female communities because it puts that labor back into the women, and there's this almost liberal way of, oh, you're doing great, but then it's again perpetuating the model that all the caring for themselves and for the city as a whole is a burden of women, and that it also doesn't address structural problems of caring and of infrastructure in the city by focusing only on that community building, which is great, but it's not it's not justice. So that's something very beautiful she said. It's not, the goal of that is not towards justice. It's fixing a problem, but it's making the women work double, triple, and it's not equal to the rest of the citizens of.
Y solo mencionar como acciones realmente del cuidado institucionalizado, el desarrollo de los 400 y tantos jardines del gobierno del Bachelet.
So part of
Eso es justicia, digamos.
Our first female president in her first presidency, right? In her second presidency, had a focus on caring and particularly on infant and preschool children, and she had a very strong program that opened more than 400 daycares in that period of time.
Muchas gracias, Pía, por los comentarios. No sé si quieres, si respondemos de inmediato o recogemos algún otro comentario o pregunta antes de seguir. Maca, juntemos los dos y luego.
And can I just want to say one thing in response. So first, thank you. Those are beautiful. I understood a little bit to see the beauty of your language. And I agree. I'm interested that we build more caring communities and more caring cities so everybody can care more and that there's the support for that. And I think that's fundamentally where we need to be going. And so the answer isn't like, oh, women are always doing this, and let's stay there. But it's more, how do we value care and create cities that value care and provide supports for care, and that everybody can value and enjoy and partake in caregiving. So I'll stop. Okay, yes, please. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brenda, for your talk. And it's very interesting for the Chilean case to see it in a wider perspective and context, and compare also your French data is really interesting and makes a lot of sense. My question is perhaps very general, but it relates to the fact that as care infrastructure also involves policies and programs, not only funds, and some actions. How do you think these initiatives might change, right? Or include this dimension? You mentioned that there's lots of resistance. Some actors don't want to acknowledge these flows. But how these programs do you think should materialize? Including these critical clues. Right.
Yeah, it's a good one. And I agree. And I think that there have been some interesting conversations, both at kind of the urban and then the national scale around this. And, one of the problems that we have that I think happens in a lot of places is that caregiving is undervalued and underpaid, right? So that if, for example, you're working full time, and often what happens is that you end up paying somebody a little bit of money, either at a childcare or, as a, you called the word different than I did, but as somebody who helps you in your house, right? So first of all, we need to value and increase subsidies and wage floors for caregivers, but that has to deal with the general fact that wages haven't been increasing in most places, right? So let's say I make, I don't know, $15 an hour, and then I have to pay my caregiver $12. That doesn't equate. So there has to be subsidies for caregivers and for caring institutions and helpers. And that can actually happen within spaces that are designed better for caregiving, right? So, I think this is something that some cities are working on a little better. If I have to drive an hour to take my child, or on a bus, or walk an hour to get to school or childcare, and then I get to go another hour, right? That's a lot of time. So do we build in transportation-oriented development, caregiving spaces right into how, and that was Dolores Hayden, this feminist architect, I don't know if you know her, from the, said that why not build in both the space that allows caregiving to happen easier, but then centers and childcare, sort of spaces closer to and within. So part of it is a design strategy. Part of it is subsidies, wage, revaluing caregiving, and giving choice, right? Because that is kind of a piece of it, and thinking about doing care in these ways that are sort of spatially and politically reorganized, because not everybody wants to always be in a cooperative, or that, we do have work, situations. And in that sense, the visibility that happened during the pandemic, I think, was valuable, right? And it did show people, like, all that work that academics and professionals we would keep hidden, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm baking a cake while I'm, there's all these funny memes, but it made people understand. And, in places around the world, people have struck, they go on strikes and they're like, I will do no, and some of that's happening in different parts of the world, but how about we don't do caregiving or domestic labor for a day or two, right? I do think those political things are super important. We did it in Poland around the abortion. They've done it in the Netherlands. I think Spain is that, so it's hard to get people to participate, but I think that organizing is also needed. So I think multiple scales, some can be urban, some can be, national policies, some are economic wage oriented, some are spatial, some are, so.
Here's called feminist strike.
Yes.
One day, March 8th.
Yeah, International Women's Day. Yeah. But I think the reality is most people don't fully, they still get their kid dressed and take them to school, right? I'm not sure that that, so we need to think about, but yes, I agree.
Ok. Vale. ¿Algo más? ¿Tu nombre?
Ariel.
Just a follow-up on that, and it's sort of, I loved your talk, and it really hit home because part of the reason why I moved from the Midwest to Chile is because it was very difficult being a young mother in academia in the Midwest and isolated from a network. And my whole salary as an assistant professor went right into a wonderful daycare for my daughter, but it's much more manageable here. But that's very personal. But at the same time, I see these numbers and I live them. I literally 8 years in the US and being a mother in the pandemic, it's one of the worst places to be a mother and a woman in the world. And I just want to put it into perspective because even though we have a lot of things to do in Chile, there are things like, for example, any employer of more than, I don't know the number of employees, maybe 100, needs to have a childcare center in the facilities or pay you to take your child somewhere else.
70.
70
employees.
Yeah, I think it's 70. But for example, I was employed here by a university. My daughter, this is until your kids are 2, but it's a lot of money. And so I moved here. My daughter turned 2, so I was out of the bonus. But that's the policy that is groundbreaking for someone who lived those first 2 years in a US context. So what I want to say, in a way, we see these numbers and it seems like Chile, but I think we have more of a caring infrastructure to build on. So I think, I don't know why I see, but I find it hopeful. And I find it also hopeful that it was a center point of the new constitution, which didn't pass, but I think it also helped us to talk about these things. So just, to mention that context. But I also wanna, this is sort of going back to the visibility of the pandemic. The question is, because it's been a while and people in the US particularly are pretty much back to normal. And I fear that even though this caring was so visible during 2 years, that people are sort of going back to normal and we've lost the momentum to make really political change in that regard. I don't know how you feel about that.
I mean, the US is, so today is an election day in the United States, and I think there is some truth to that, but not full. I mean, I think there have been so many other attacks on women and women's rights and other things happening, and yes, I think there was some momentum that has been slowed, but I don't think any woman or caregiver is really forgetting what happened. So I think there's still a will there, not as much of a visibility momentum, which has partly to do with the whole picture of what's going on in the United States. But I think that it was a global awareness building too, right? So even as other places adopt models too, and really Biden was trying to make care part of the infrastructure and increases for it. So even to see that actually make it into our United States policy, we have no maternity leave. I mean, the United States is terrible. Yeah, I have 3 children. I raised them as an academic in the Midwest. Yes, it's not good. So momentum, probably some of it has been lost, but I don't think all of it. And I think a lot of women made sacrifices, and right now they're just trying to sort of figure it out. But I think that will translate. I'm going to remain hopeful that will translate into still some effort and action. But yes, and there's always a backlash to everything.
Ariel?
Sí, necesito traducción. Sí.
Okay.
Can you continue? I continue. You're exhausted. I will.
No, it's okay.
Son 2 preguntas, 2 cuestiones.
2 questions.
La primera es, en circunstancias en que necesitamos como sociedad que los cuidados sean descentralizados de lo privado. ¿Cuál es la definición que entonces asume el hogar? Como lo que ha venido siendo como una esfera privada, por una parte, y propiedad privada también, Y en tanto propiedad privada, ¿cuál es la vía económica de resolución cuando se descentralizan los cuidados?
So he's saying, so if we consider that in order for more equal cities, we need to decentralize caring, how does that change the meaning of the home and not the house, the home unit, in the sense that something that was private and hidden in that unit, I would say both as building but also as household, how that meaning changes when those caring activities get out of the house and are sort of more widespread around the city.
Yeah. So I did write a paper where I talk about sort of material feminists and sort of the home as a space for change and transformation, right? So in my mind, I'm sure there are some negatives, but I think that idea of the home overflowing into cities and the care of the home sort of overflowing into caring that's happening in the cities, I think is a positive change, because really caring has never just been about, even if we think the most traditional model possible, a mom, and it's always been about extended family or community members and neighborhoods, but we often haven't had the physical infrastructure that enables that, or the gendered ideas that open up caregiving for multiple people to do caring work and to not be shamed for it or not feel like they have to do other kinds of things. So I think thinking of care overflowing or outflowing from the home into cities and dissolving a little bit of that public-private in a way that you said makes more visible too, but violence or unhealthy things are happening could be a positive thing. And when you see places where lots of men, for example, are doing caring, it's more likely that other men are going to be like, oh, that happens. There are parts of the world where you see men really actively involved in caring. And then I notice other men looking and they're like, oh, I can do that too. So I think it can have a positive. And again, this is maybe US specific, but we've lost, loneliness is one of the biggest problems in many parts of Europe and the United States. I think it's less so in other places, but connection through care, whether it's caring for somebody with a disability or caring those are all things that are of the home, but they're also of the city or ought to be. Does that make sense? I don't know.
I forget.
I forgot his second question. I have
Javier?
some 3 comments.
Loud.
Yeah, sorry, I took this opportunity. Well, Brenda used to be my research methods professor, so I'm going to ask about methods, about epistemology. Intersectionality.
Yeah.
How do you consider it? Is it a method? Is it an epistemology? Is it a theoretical framework? When I was reading feminist perspectives in the US, it is not quite actually a theoretical framework, but you can use it as a theoretical framework or not. It's kind of in the middle. So how do you read that? Second, following the thread from Pia, this communitarian and cooperative feminist solutions, okay, we have a lot of problems. Why don't we solve it together? But just together, not with the state, not with the rest of the system. So what should happen with men? That's for me. I'm the man. what should happen with us? Because if women are just solving their problems, and Dolores Hayden actually put that issue.
Yeah, she does.
She mentions mandatory care by men. In China and Cuba, actually. I don't know if it's still mandatory in China and Cuba, but it's something that you should do. Actually, I have proposed it several times here in discussions about gender, that we should measure our scholarly metrics. This is important for your universities too, weighted by our domestic care. If we did that, we will force men to do more domestic work, and we will liberate women to be measured more equally in terms of men. So it's both ways around, right? You affect men, you affect women, and you create incentives or mandates to do what we need to do. It's not just women helping women. And then a clarification of maybe the history of the US, because I read about the first liberal feminists, the first feminists, the suburban feminists, like white suburban feminists, that they put the issue of returning to work right away after having birth, and then without asking for any maternity leave. And that's the reason, because the US is the only developed country that doesn't have maternity leave. Maybe. So can you explain that? How is that constructed? Or
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the middle question just because I think it builds on your question about care. So absolutely, when I talk about this, to me, we want a caring city where everybody cares, whether you're male, female, non-binary, and we ought to have all kinds of models of caregiving. So I don't know if you know about the Whole House in Chicago, Jane Addams.
Yeah.
It was an example, let me see, where these middle-class women in the late 1800s, they created a community where they lived there and they took care of immigrants coming in. They did all kinds of programming, etc. Some scholars have called that a queer domesticity, right? It's challenging. By queer, I mean alternative, different way of caring together. Men were there, women were there, etc. So I'm interested in queer domesticities, in queer ways of understanding care that aren't only about, well, heterosexual, relationships where, so yes, I mean, there are lots of examples where just even providing caregiving leave for the caregiver, and then like in many parts in Europe, you get a longer leave as a woman if you're married to a man, if your partner takes a leave too, right? So these kinds of policy incentives. And in fact, I used to study women, I've done some research on women in academia. One thing they found is that when men took a caregiving paternity leave, they published more when their wife had a baby.
Of course.
So we need to figure some of those things out. But yes, I think enabling structures of care, incentivizing them, making them visible where men, women, non-binary folks, everybody is caring, and that becomes normalized as a key part of change. And so even though I'm giving examples of feminist commenting, like, women-led, men can be part of commenting. There's lots of cooperatives that are about this. Some of the original cooperatives, like I said, from Latin America and Spain, all those, they have had a problem with this, right? It's like they do worker cooperatives, but the women are still taking care of the children. And that's where Silvia Federici's work, I think, which is about reproduction and all caring, is important. Like, we need to model these different ways. So 100% agree with you. And I also will say that a feminist city can be good for everybody. Because if you push a stroller and you can get around, then you can get around in a wheelchair. If a woman has a childcare nearby or has a space that enables caregiving, then a man has that, so I think those things are important. But also noting that until we're there, we have to also acknowledge some of the political realities and supports too. Okay, the last question about that women were pushing for. So I don't know the exact answer. All I can say is that's certainly not the reason in the past 40 years. And if that was the case, it really also goes back to the fact that in the United States, we have always overvalued work. That's how not just economically, but your sort of position, sociality. So for women, and this is Betty Friedan and the feminist mystique, to kind of gain access to equity, they understood that that's where the power really lied, not just economically, but also in terms of visibility and sort of power, et cetera. So I can see that there probably would have been a concession like, all right, yeah, let's just get into that workplace because it offers some mobility and freedom and status. And I think a lot of feminists in the United States will say, like, we kind of traded one thing for another, right? It's like, oh yeah, you can be in the workplace and you can, in some cases have parity in pay, in some cases, in some situations, but then you still have to do all that domestic work at home, et cetera. So I think that's really been a challenge of the way that feminism unfolded in the United States, is that it sort of centered work in a particular setting. And the reason we don't have maternity leave now, I think, is the US doesn't want to, well, it's about social supports, but also has to do with compelling businesses to do anything that they don't want to do. Last, I know people might be getting tired, intersectionality. I shouldn't save the hardest question for last. I see it as some of all of those things in the same way. Like intersectionality is a method, right? It's about how you, in an epistemology, it's about how you understand and carry out research. And I will say I've written about this, like it's really hard to look at all kinds of power relations and all kinds of marginalizations in any given study, right? I mean, I just think that's the reality, that you're always trying to attend to it, but there's always something you're missing, right? When we center gender, you know, and this idea that these things can't be, there's an argument that you can't, intersectionality means you can't disassemble in anybody's given life, any of these, but I still believe you can look at power structures at the same time. I can understand that I couldn't separate gender, race, ability in your own life, but I can still say gender works as a structure, ableism works as a structure, race works as a structure. So I try to do both of those things without saying I can suspend your gender when I understand your lives or the lives of community. So, you know, I guess I would see it as some of all of those things, method, theory, and epistemology. But I think it's a tricky, you know, I mean, it's sort of just it become, in my own work, it's like a piece of each of those, but there will be debate. Some people will say it's method, some people will say, so I sort of see it as all those three. It's a good question. I like that. Thank you.
Any more questions for them?
Yes. You allow like maybe a bit of more personal question, because you talked about hope.
Yeah.
And I heard you, or I interpreted you as expecting the world getting better and better in the future. And looking at the US right now, I feel like maybe we should be talking more about resistance and survival. And also I, as maybe many other Chileans here, are at their most pessimistic political moment in our recent history. So where does your hope come from? How do you?
I love that question on election
how are you?
day.
How are you?
Yeah. Well, so I guess I have a couple of answers to that question. One is I've read enough history to really understand that almost all things that are progressive receive a backlash, right? And that to understand those kind of double movements, I think for me, keeps a sense of hope to say, of course, when you push a new constitution, there's going to be pushback and a sort of backlash to some of these. Or of course, when feminism and sexual violence becomes really visible, that there's going to be a pushback like in the United States, as there has been to the Me Too movement. So to have a long view that maybe is beyond my lifetime, for sure, right? To say like, yes, that we will experience challenges. I don't see any kind of linear trajectory. And I don't think anybody who is aiming for justice you could be hopeful, but not delusion, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But to understand in the long trajectory that there will be pushbacks and there will be backlashes, but to remain oriented around hope, to remain oriented around even politics of survival are in a sense hopeful, right? I mean, I was listening to this talk by a woman who wrote a book about slavery and indigenous histories in the United States, which were about mass murder, et cetera. And she says, it gives me hope that my ancestors survived what is so terrible, right? In Chile, here you have, and so to know that people survived and thrived and brought hope and brought justice in the ways that they could in horrible times, I think is just sort of how I see the world. Like, yes, we keep pushing for them, but we also understand there'll be backlash, there will be pushback, there will be very difficult moments, but that's not, I often say I'm somewhere between hope and despair. You keep criticizing but then you keep moving forward. And in any given moment, you know, you can practice hope, you can practice solidarity, you can practice survival. And that's sort of how is that helpful?
Thank you.
And, you know, I teach, so I have to like, you know, I don't know, I can't just give my students or my children despair. I have to offer something else. And I believe it. I mean, that's how I see the world. Yeah.
Someone else, some other question? Comments?
And you know, I'm teaching 8 classes, so you may hear more than you want to hear from me.
Mencionar que las clases abiertas están con cupos completos, sin embargo, vamos confirmando semana a semana y se van liberando algunas vacantes, así que si alguien está interesado o interesada en asistir, puede escribir al correo que está en la página web y nosotros evaluamos si es que hay alguna clase en la que se puede asistir. Eso, y bueno, ahora agradecer la asistencia presencial a esta primera jornada de la serie Jornadas de Investigación en el Instituto. Ya son tradición semestralmente desde el 2018, y el objetivo es ir mostrando y poniendo sobre la mesa los diferentes temas de investigación en que trabajan los profesores e investigadores del instituto, convocando a invitados externos, en este caso Pía, muchas gracias. Bueno, Pía no es tan externa porque hizo el magíster en Desarrollo Urbano y hizo su doctorado acá en la facultad también, al igual que Valentina. Así que nada, agradecer la presencia y lo dejamos invitados a la siguiente jornada de investigación, que es un tema totalmente distinto. El profesor Kyle Bergamini va a exponer el resultado de su investigación en docencia, llamada Investigación aplicada en docencia universitaria, el caso del curso de Exploraciones Urbanas, Territorio Sustentable, el cual derivó en un manual de docencia también para esos temas. Así que nada, muchas gracias y los esperamos en las siguientes jornadas de la